Hello, everyone. This is the 141st episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I welcome back Brazilian journalist Mr. José Inácio Werneck as we discuss the Brazil national team during the 1974 World Cup. Mr. Werneck is a journalist, lawyer, interpreter, translator, writer, and a triathlete. Hello, Jose Inácio. Welcome back.
Hello, Sean. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Let's go back in time. Following the triumph of the 1970 World Cup, what was the state of the affairs and changes in Brazilian football since in terms of football culture and sociologically?
Shambles. Total disorganization. Politically, Brazil was going through a very bad period with the military dictatorship, and there was an almost kind of paranoia about security. This was reflected in the fact that when Brazil arrived for the World Cup in Germany, and you must remember that 2 years before in the Olympic Games in Munich had been that attempt against Israeli athletes. And so there was this heavy security in Germany for the World Cup in 1974. And this was compounded by the fear the Brazilian government had about demonstrations, about people asking for democracy, and the personality of Zagallo himself, who was a very kind of closed personality. He very tight in the way of his thinking. He was always afraid of criticism and things like that. And this was reflected in the fact that Brazil lived through concentration camps in Germany, if we can use this expression, because all the places where Brazil went, from town to town to town to town, Brazil stayed at hotels where they erected barriers, walls in front of the hotel, and the access of the press was very restricted. So there was a climate of, I would repeat this word, paranoia. There was a fear of political demonstrations and a Zagallo fear of criticism of his team for the World Cup, because the team for the World Cup from 1970 to 1974 had been drastically changed. You lost players like Carlos Alberto Torres, Clodoaldo, Gerson, Tostão, Pelé. This is the backbone of the team. All very important players and playing in central position. Carlos Alberto was the captain of the team, remember. And the Clodoaldo, Gerson dominating the midfield, Tostão as a kind of a false nine playing with Pelé. All this was lost. Brazil was going through a phase of transition. Zagallo was very hesitant, and all this really bode very badly for Brazil in that 1974 World Cup.
So we have to start off with Pele. In all of our previous podcasts, we charted his level of fame in the world from tournament to tournament. This was the first World Cup in 20 years that would not feature Pele. Can you describe the nation's reaction to his absence?
Yeah. The reaction was that people really missed him. And I was at the game in Maracanã in 1971. That was Pelé's farewell from the Brazil national team. Brazil played Yugoslavia. And Pelé went around, he played for a few more minutes, and then he went around the whole pitch, and everybody shouted, Pelé, Pelé, Pelé. So in 1974, Pelé was there only as an observer, working for Pepsi Cola as a kind of a publicity man. And people really feared not having Pelé would be a big blow for Brazil. But I have to add that not having Pelé and not having Gerson, not having Tostão, and not having Clodoaldo. And the interesting thing about Clodoaldo is for a long time, Zagallo hoped to have Clodoaldo in the team until the very last match before the World Cup. Brazil played in Basel, Switzerland, and Clodoaldo was in the lineup, and he played the first half. But in the last minute of the first half, he felt again the muscle pull in his leg, left the field, and everybody knew that Clodoaldo was out of the World Cup just a couple of days 10 days maybe before the start of the World Cup. So that psychologically was also a very heavy blow to Brazil. And Brazil was going to play Yugoslavia in the first game. Yugoslavia was a team whose coach, Miljanic, knew Brazil very well. He had worked for Brazil before as an observer. And so everybody was fearing that game. And that was reflected in the fact that Brazil played a defensive role. It was a 0-0 match. The Yugoslavia, in fact, was more dangerous, created more opportunities than Brazil. Brazil, from the beginning of the second half, Brazil was only defending. Yugoslavia, an European team that was supposed to defend against the Brazilian brilliance and technique, was attacking and Brazil was defending. And the result was very disturbing. From that moment on, people really lost faith that Brazil could do anything in that World Cup.
Were there any attempts by government officials to lure Pele back into the national team that you remember?
There were, but Pelé was adamant, and he knew that at that point, for him, better as a player was to retire with all the glory rather than risk going in. And he knew the team was not going to be as good as the team in 1970. So he knew that he really had nothing to gain and everything to lose if he went to play for Brazil in 1974.
Brazil were still managed by the 1970 World Cup winning manager Mario Zagallo.
Yes.
Was he himself still a popular choice at this point? Was the public behind him?
Not really. Zagallo was always a very controversial character in Brazil, ever since he was a player. Some people liked him, some people didn't like him. He was too defensive, too cautious. For instance, in 1970, people kind of thought that he, unlike the former coach João Saldanha, was very much kind of trying to please the military government. He was always people admitted that as a coach, Zagallo was a good tactician, but he was too fearful of exposing and taking risks, exposing the team to risks.
Now, how did his tactics differ this time from 1970? Given all the absences that you mentioned, were his tactics dictated by these absences, including Pele?
Oh, yes. The fact is that he didn't have a playmaker like Gerson, who retired very early from football. Gerson, if I remember well, was only 33. Just at that time was still playing for Fluminense, but he was not in a very good physical shape. Gerson, you may recall, was a heavy smoker. So physically, he was never very fit. And at that point, he was, in the last days of his career. And it was a huge absence in midfield, because the man who was supposed to do what Gerson did in 1970 was Rivellino. Rivellino was a brilliant player, but not a leader on the field, on the pitch, like Gerson was. So that was a very big hole in Brazil. Of course, Clodoaldo was a very creative, a midfielder who was good defensively, but also creative. So there was no one replacing Clodoaldo at the same technical level. And in the forward line, they had to depend on Jairzinho, playing as center forward, because they didn't have Tostão. Levinha was never a player who was really up to the job. And so, in fact, what happened is that in Jairzinho as a center forward, they never had a center forward that was really capable of 100% a center forward, and they lost an excellent right winger because they had to play with Valdomiro from Rio Grande do Sul, who technically was not the same level as Jairzinho.
There had been this belief in South American circles following the 1966 World Cup that due to favoritism, South American teams would struggle in a World Cup on European soil. Was that the general belief still that you remember?
No, I don't think that was any real. Maybe some people would say that as a remembrance, as a memory of the 1966 World Cup, in which they remember that there was a lot of controversy involving South American teams like Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil. They all complained against European referees. But I don't think this was a factor in the 1970 World Cup. I don't remember anybody really saying in Brazil in 1974 that Brazil lost because the European referees of FIFA were against Brazil. You must remember that in 1974 was the year when João Avelange was elected, a Brazilian, was elected president of FIFA. So there was not this atmosphere anymore.
Brazil, as defending champions, did not have to play any qualifiers. So in the intervening years, you have the very important Brazil Independence Cup in 1972 that featured many European teams. You also have the summer tour in 1973 where Brazil played against quality opposition. There were matches against West Germany and a famous loss to Italy. What was the general takeaway from the team's progress in these few years?
Well, what happened is that in 1970, to give you an example, the general feeling was that before going to Mexico, Brazil was a shambles, was terribly disorganized. You must remember that João Saldanha was sacked as coach, and Zagallo then became the new coach, and there were a lot of doubts about how who would play, if Tostão would play, Tostão wouldn't play, and all that. So there was a lot of insecurity. And in 1974, it was the opposite. Brazil had come from the Independence tournament, Cup tournament, had done this tour of Europe. There was this feeling that Brazil was going to be well organized, but just before going to Europe, then lots of problems arose, and Zagallo kind of lost his confidence in the team. He didn't really know whether to play Paulo César Carpegiani in midfield, whether to play Paulo César, Caju, as he was known in Brazil, to differentiate from the other Paulo César, Carpegiani. He was in doubt about who to play, Nelinho or as right fullback. I will remember his name in a second. So it was the opposite. When Brazil arrived in Germany, that's when the doubts started to creep in the Brazilian public, and also, I would say, in Zagallo's head.
So this was also the era of total football of Ajax and the Dutch national team, as well as Bayern Munich. Were Brazilian observers conscious of that aspect of European football?
They were not really very well aware of what was going on. I remember going to Europe before the 1974 World Cup. I think it was in 1973. And I met a friend of mine from Brazil who was living in Paris at that time as a refugee, as exiled because of the political situation in Brazil. And he said, there is a wonderful player for the Netherlands called Johan Cruyff. And people in Brazil were not really aware of that. No, and Johan Cruyff, my friend was totally right. Johan Cruyff was the great player of that Holland team, the Netherlands team in the World Cup. And also Neskens, who recently died, was a fantastic player for that Netherlands team. I think Brazilians were not really aware of the progress that the Europeans had made since 1970. What happened is that the Europeans had learned their lessons about the Brazilian tactics, the Brazilian way of playing, and the Brazil had not kept up to date with what the Europeans were doing. Zé Maria, the name of the right fullback, I was mentioning, forgot his name temporarily.
Early in 1974, Zagallo dropped Carlos Alberto, as you mentioned, who was deemed to be out of form. He also dropped the 1970 goalkeeper Felix. Felix had actually criticized Zagallo for overworking the squad. Brazil played a number of pre-World Cup friendlies ahead of the tournament. There are matches at Maracana against Mexico that finishes 1-1. They defeat Czechoslovakia 1-0. They defeat Bulgaria 1-0. At Sao Paulo, they defeat Romania 2-0. They have matches against Haiti. They win comfortably 4-0. Oh, this is in April, by the way, late March and April. They tie with Greece in a scoreless tie at Maracana. Then at Sao Paulo in May, again another scoreless tie against Austria. Then followed by a 2-1 win over Ireland and a 2-0 win over Paraguay. Then they go to Europe for the final phase of preparations, and they play against regional teams at Ludwigshafen and also in France. And that match at Basel against the select Basel City team, they win 5-2, but I guess that's the match that Clodoaldo is injured. None of the friendly opponents were particularly the best of the teams in the world at that point. Was there pessimism or optimism following these friendlies?
Oh, there was pessimism. As I said, at that time, I was the sports columnist for Jornal do Brasil. As I wrote just before that friendly, I remember writing, Brazil arrived in Europe and everything that seemed to be certain about the Brazilian team now is in doubt. Nobody really knows what is going to happen with this team. And that is exactly what the general feeling was, especially after the first game against Yugoslavia. And the second game against Scotland and Brazil drew again, made that impression only even bigger, stronger. People didn't really have confidence in that Brazilian team.
Just before the World Cup, and not only Clodoaldo was cut from the team, but also backup goalkeeper Wendell of Botafogo and Carbone of Botafogo as well. So the squad is getting trimmed. You already mentioned, but ahead of the World Cup, João Havelange was elected as FIFA president, taking over from Sir Stanley Rouse.
Yeah.
What was the reaction at that time?
People in Brazil didn't really care much. João Havelange was, of course, in a political campaign. It was important for him, to be president of FIFA. But he also was a controversial figure in Brazil, especially because of the World Cup in 1970 and the World Cup in 1966. He was very criticized, even though Brazil won the World Cup in 1970. And, he tried to taint his campaign to make people think that his campaign was very important because Brazil then could be a leader in world soccer, not only on the field, on the pitch, but politically. But people were not really very interested in that.
Let's look at Brazil's final 22 players for this World Cup. At number 1, you have starting goalkeeper Emerson Leao of Palmeiras. He was also in the 1970 squad. Number 2 in defense, you have Luis Pereira of Palmeiras. Number 3 in defense, you have Marinho Perez of Santos. Number 4, Zé Maria of Corinthians in defense. Number 5, the captain of the team, Wilson Piazza of
Who had
Cruzeiro.
Played in 1970, yeah.
Yes. Number 6 in defense, you have Marinho Chagas of Botafogo. Number 7, you have Jairzinho of Botafogo up front, and he was the only veteran from the 1966 World Cup as well as 1970.
Yeah.
Number 8, up front, you have Leivinha of Palmeiras. Number 9, up front, you have Cesar of Palmeiras. Number 10, you have Roberto Rivellino of Corinthians in midfield from a 1970 World Cup winner. Number 11, you have Paulo Cesar Lima or Paulo Cesar Cahu, as whichever one it's used.
In Brazil, he was known as Paulo Cesar Caju because of his hair.
Yeah. Of Flamengo in midfield. Again, he was also part of the 1970 team. Number 12, backup goalkeeper, you have Renato of Flamengo. Number 13, up front, you have Valdomiro of Internacional Porto Alegre. Number 14, in defense, you have Nelinho of Cruzeiro.
Nelinho, for some time, was actually the first choice for Zagallo. And then, during the World Cup, decided to go with Zé Maria, but go on.
Number 15, in defense, you have Alfredo of Palmeiras. Number 16, in defense, you have Marco Antonio of Fluminense, and he was also a veteran of the 1970 World Cup. At number 17, in midfield, you have Paulo Cesar Carpegiani of Internacional Porto Alegre. Number 18, in midfield, you have Ademir da Guia of Palmeiras, and Let's remember he was the son of Domingos Daguia, who was a veteran of the 1938 World Cup. I think
Yes.
this may have been the first father and son combination in a World Cup. Someone can check.
Domingos da Guia was a famous player in football in Brazil, in Brazilian history. He was known as the Divine Domingos. And his son was the son of the Divine.
Yes.
Ademir da Guia. And Ademir was given this name because of the Brazilian center forward Ademir Menezes from the 1950 World Cup. So people would say that there were two big football players, Ademir and da Guia, who was his father, Domingos da Guia.
Number 19 as striker, you have Mirandina of Sao Paulo. Number 20, another striker, you have Edu of Santos, a veteran of the 1970 World Cup. Number 21 at striker, you have Dirceu José Guimarães of Botafogo. At number 22, third goalkeeper, you have Valdir Perez de Arruda of Sao Paulo, who would be Brazil's goalkeeper in the 1982 World Cup.
Yes.
In all, you have 6 players from Rio, 12 players from Sao Paulo, 2 players from Minas Gerais, and 2 players from Rio Grande do Sul. From this squad, Marco Antonio, Cesar Malusco, and backup goalkeepers Renato and Valdir Perez would not make any appearances in this World Cup.
Edu, if I'm not mistaken, was only on the team when Brazil desperately needed to score goals
Yeah, he
against
played one match, I
Zaire
believe.
in order
Yeah.
to qualify, to go forward there.
We mentioned Jairzinho was part of the 1966 squad, and from the 1970 squad, you still have Jairzinho, Leao Rivellino, Paulo Cesar, Edu, and Marco Antonio.
I would say that a big problem for Brazil is that when they realized that they didn't have Carlos Alberto Torres, they didn't have Gerson, they didn't have Clodoaldo, Tostão, Pelé, all players who were leaders on the pitch, the team depended too much on Rivellino. And for instance, I'll give you an example. Maradona said that the best player he ever saw was Rivellino. Maradona was a big fan of Rivellino. And Rivellino was a fantastic player in technique, but he was never a leader on the field. And that was the problem. Brazil went to the World Cup with Rivellino, a great player, brilliant player, but didn't lead the team like Gerson did, for instance, in midfield, not to mention the other players.
Significantly, Mario Zagallo became the first Brazil manager to lead the team in 2 consecutive World Cups.
Yeah. Zagallo, I want to say that again because people forget about that. Zagallo had a fantastic career in soccer. Zagallo died last year. He was the world champion as a player in 1958, in 1962. He won the World Cup as a coach in 1970. He was the assistant coach in 1994 in the United States. He took Brazil to the final in 1998 in France in the World Cup. An incredible career as a football player and as a coach.
As always, the expectations are that Brazil has to win in a World Cup. But given all the changes, what were the realistic expectations of the Brazilian press?
Well, I can tell you about my expectations. They were very low. Before the World Cup, although I have all my columns, I have them in my files. Before the World Cup, and especially after we started World Cup, I said that Brazil really was defending against Yugoslavia in the first game. It was exactly the opposite of what people would normally expect. Brazil in the second half of that game didn't create any opportunities of goal. Brazil kind of was relying on counter-attacking, but without really going forward. So what kind of counter-attacking is that in which you don't really create any opportunity to score? I don't remember any opportunity for scoring for Brazil in the second half of that game.
And speaking of yourself, where were you in life and how did you observe this World Cup as a spectator and professionally?
Well, I was working for Jornal do Brasil. I had covered for Jornal do Brasil as a reporter the World Cup in 1966 and the World Cup in 1970. And in 1974, I was working as a columnist, a sports columnist for Jornal do Brasil. So my job then was a little bit different. Before I was trying to find, facts to report. Now I was analyzing them. It is a different situation. What I really remember from this World Cup are kind of going to the Brazilian camp in all the different places and this heavy atmosphere. I even had an incident with one of the guys in the Brazilian security. I had written something in the newspaper unfavorable about him, shouting and behaving in a very kind of aggressive manner towards everybody, and he pulled me aside to complain. I had an argument with the guy. So for me, as an analyst, the impression I had from that World Cup really was that Brazil was a team that needed psychological help, because the situation, the atmosphere that you got from the so-called camps, when it was very difficult to go there and work and talk to the players, because everybody was secluded behind barriers, behind walls. This whole atmosphere impacted on the mentality of the players. And that was what Brazil showed in 1974, was a kind of a dark kind of football, totally against the spirit that the rest of the world had about what Brazil could do on a football pitch.
In interviews with the players, were they forthcoming, or like you said, there was still this mentality that they have to be closed off?
Yeah, there was this mentality. It was very difficult to have a frank conversation, to find the players in an unguarded moment. There was always this tension, and they knew that the Brazilian top administrators didn't want them to be open to the press.
Let's get to the World Cup. We already mentioned the match against Yugoslavia. In fact, that was the World Cup opener on June 13th at Frankfurt. For this match, Brazil starts with Leão, Nelinho, Luis Pereira, Marinho Perez, Marinho Chagas, Wilson Piazza, captain of the team, Rivellino, Valdomiro, Jairzinho, Leivinha, and Paulo Cesar Caju. This match ended as a scoreless tie, so already the troubling signs were there.
Yeah.
5 days later, again at Frankfurt on June 18th, they meet Scotland, and another scoreless tie. So for this match, you have Leão, Nelinho, Luis Pereira, Marinho Perez, Marinho Chagas, captain of the team Wilson Piazza, Rivellino, Jairzinho, Leivinha. He'll be replaced by Paulo Cesar Carpegiani in the 65th minute. One change, we have Mirandinha in the squad as a starter, and Paulo Cesar Caju. Brazil had to win the next match. Let's also remember that Yugoslavia, in their next match, they had defeated Zaire 9-0, and with goal difference, they seemed odds-on favorites to qualify from this group. So it was really, in terms of goal difference, a fight between Brazil and Scotland.
Yes.
And so Scotland had defeated Zaire only 2-0. And their last match was against Yugoslavia that ended as a 1-1 tie.
Yeah.
So Brazil had to win with more than 2 goals against Zaire. This match against Zaire is on June 22nd at Gelsenkirchen. Brazil starts with Leão, Nelinho, Luis Pereira, Marinho Perez, Marinho Chagas, Paulo Cesar Carpegiani, captain Wilson Piazza, who would be replaced in the 70th minute by Mirandinha. I believe he'd be injured and out of the tournament at this point. And you have Jairzinho, Leivinha. He'd be replaced by Valdomiro in the 19th minute. So Leivinha was also injured. And Rivellino and Edu of Santos. Brazil would win this match 3-0. Jairzinho scored in the 12th minute. In the 66th minute, Rivellino blasted a long-range shot from outside of the box. And in the 79th minute, Valdomiro took a cross, which became a shot from a narrow angle, and it went through in the near post. So Brazil had won, and they were through to the next round. However, this match is forever remembered for the free kick incident where Brazil is about to take a free kick, and one of the Zaire players just runs up and kicks the ball away. It was a farcical situation, but Brazil had gone through, but not in a very impressive fashion.
Yes, these are really the two moments that still live in my memory in this game. Did Valdomiro shoot or did he cross? Everybody was arguing about what did he mean to do. The fact is that he scored. Maybe he didn't mean to score, but he scored, and Brazil desperately needed that goal. And you notice that there in the lineup that Edu played, because it was a desperate situation for Brazil. Brazil had to score one more goal than Scotland, that had beaten Zaire 2-0. Brazil knew they had to win by three. They had to win by 3 goals difference. The goal came in very unlikely, 11 minutes to the end of the game, and unlike Brazil kind of growing desperate on the pitch, and an unlikely situation. Valdomiro, who was never really regarded as a great player in Brazil, he scored the goal that rescued Brazil, but nobody knew for sure whether he wanted to cross, he meant to cross, or he meant to shoot that ball. And the fact about Zaire also was, what happened at the time is that people recognized that there were talents. There was talent in the African players. They had good technique. They knew how to play. They were physically endowed with lots of qualities. But tactically, they were kind of naive and maybe even not knowing the rules, because people were saying, hey, what does this guy want? No, Brazil is going to take a free kick and he can run and kick the ball away. So that was the two things that really live in my memory in that Zaire game, was that strange situation with the Zaire player and the strange goal by Valdomiro that rescued Brazil and made Brazil go forward in the World Cup.
And we should mention the Zaire player in question was Ilunga Mwepu, who was booked for this incident. Did you witness this incident live, and what was your immediate reaction when you saw that?
People were laughing. That was the reaction. Everybody was like, hey, what is going on here? It was something totally unexpected in a World Cup game. Is this being played in a village somewhere in the hinterland of Africa, or a village in the hinterland of the Amazon in Brazil? Doesn't this guy know what he's supposed to do? Did he mean to do it to upset the game? I don't know. Nobody knew, but it was received with laughter.
In the subsequent decades, I think there have been some stories that the team were under a lot of pressure from the government to
Yes, I remember
salvage
that.
some pride. So maybe that extra pressure that was heaped on them kind of forced him to act like that. But yeah, no one really knows. Following this first round, there was a second group phase.
Yeah.
And for this second group phase, Brazil were in a group with East Germany, Argentina, and Holland. The first match in this second group phase is against East Germany at Hanover on June 26th. Brazil starts with Leao, Zemaria, who's now in the squad, Luis Pereira, Marinho Perez, who's now the captain following the injury to Wilson Piazza, Marinho Chagas, Paulo Cesar Carpegiani, Rivellino, Valdomiro, Jairzinho, Paulo Cesar Caju, and Dirceu.
Yeah.
And Brazil wins this match with a free kick from Rivellino in the 60th minute, where he just finds a hole in the East German wall and blasts it through.
Yeah. It was another poor performance for Brazil. People at that point really were not expecting anything from Brazil in the World Cup anymore.
Well, the next match are against South American rivals Argentina on June 30th at Hanover again. Brazil starts with Leao, Zemaria, Luis Pereira, Marinho Perez, captain of the team, Marinho Chagas, Paulo Cesar Carpegiani, Rivellino, Valdomiro, Jairzinho, Paulo Cesar Caju, and Dirceu. Brazil takes the lead in the 32nd minute when Rivellino scored with a long-range shot. 3 minutes later, Argentina ties the match through a free kick from Miguel Angel Brindisi.
Yeah.
Just after the start of the second half, in the 49th minute, Jairzinho heads in Zemaria's cross from the right, and Brazil win this match 2-1.
Yeah.
So 2 matches, 2 wins. At the same time, the Dutch, they've defeated Argentina 4-0 in impressive fashion, and they've defeated East Germany 2-0. So as the teams are playing for the decisive match, the Dutch are ahead on goal difference.
Yes.
Not only on goal difference, but in confidence and in any other sense, they are looked upon as the better team and as favorites as they face each other on July 3rd at Dortmund. For this decisive match against the great Dutch side, Brazil starts with Leao, Zé Maria, Luis Pereira, Marinho Perez, captain of the team, Marinho Chagas, Paulo Cesar Carpegiani, Rivellino, Valdomiro, Paulo Cesar Caju. He'd be replaced by Mirandinha in the 61st minute, Jairzinho, and Dirceu. This match would be remembered for all the yellow cards and even a red card for Brazil. And as far as the Dutch team, we already mentioned not only Cruyff, you have Niskens, you have Krol, Arie Haan, Johnny Rep. It's the great Dutch side, Rob Ransenbrink. The Dutch take the lead in the 50th minute when Cruyff crosses from the right and Niskens knocked it in.
Yeah.
In the 65th minute, Krol crosses from the left side, and this time it's Johan Cruyff who knocks in, and the Dutch take a 2-0 lead. Now, at this point, again, Brazil has already had a number of bookings. Luis Pereira has already been booked in the first half. Just before the end, in the 84th minute, he is sent off for another foul. As he leaves the field, there are taunts from the Dutch supporters, and he holds his three fingers, signifying 3 World Cup wins. Later on, after the tournament, in fact, Marinho Chagas, he was suspended for 3 international matches for kicking Johan Niskens during the match. But this was after the World Cup.
Yeah.
At this point, Brazil's football was found out against a much better side. What was the aftermath of this match?
If I may, I will start with before the match, if you don't mind. At that point, before the match, everybody was in awe of the Netherlands. And I remember Brazil had a coach, Paulo Amaral, who was working in the World Cup as an observer of the other teams. So he was going around watching the other teams that Brazil might eventually play. And one of the games he went to was the Argentina game when the Netherlands destroyed Argentina. And I remember that he came back and he had all these tactic notations. And basically, after all, he drew all the arrows in different directions. People looked at that and said, well, what can we make of that? You know, nobody really could make any sense of his arrows, his drawing. And what Zagallo decided to do, because everybody was talking about how the Dutch defense was cleverly using the offside line. They would go forward and let the offensive adversaries, the other team, the forwards, offside. And Zagallo, this kind of concocted a way of playing the ball from the back, not to the guy who was playing up front, but someone who would come back from midfield and go forward. And the guy up front would come back to place himself in an onside position, and the ball was passed forward, aerial ball usually, over the head of the Dutch defense for somebody coming from behind. And with that, the fact is that Brazil in the first half had, I think both in the first half, Brazil had 2 very good chances of scoring. One with Jairzinho and one with Paulo César Caju. They missed both chances. Brazil didn't score, and Holland prevailed in the second half. But from the very beginning of the game, really what stood out was the roughness of the game, especially from Brazil, especially Zé Maria. I remember after the start of the game, Zé Maria kicking Cruyff And everybody was in an uproar. Everybody was booing. Most of the supporters there were from the Netherlands. Netherlands very near Germany. They had a border with Germany, so there were lots of Dutch supporters. And there was a very unfriendly atmosphere surrounding that match. And I also remember that Henry Kissinger, one of the things that I remember about that match is that the United States Foreign Secretary at the time was watching the game. He was always, he was born in Germany. As you know, he was always a very keen football supporter. He was in that World Cup, and he was sitting there next to João Avelange, the newly elected president of FIFA. And that was it for Brazil. People didn't really expect Brazil to win that game. Brazil actually had the opportunity to win that game, but people didn't really expect. And, people were not surprised to see Holland win. And there was the famous incident with Luis Pereira. And Brazil kind of managed in the space of 4 years to destroy the sympathy that 1970 had created for Brazil in the world. Everybody admiring the Brazilian football, the Brazilian technique, the jogo bonito, the beautiful game. And Brazil totally destroyed that in the 1974 World Cup, especially in this game against the Netherlands.
The Dutch would reach the final playing against the hosts, West Germany, while Brazil had to play the third place match against Poland at Munich on July 6th. For this match, Brazil starts with Leão, Zé Maria, Marinho Perez, captain of the team. Playing for the first time, Alfredo Mostarda, Chagas, Paulo Cesar Carpegiani, Rivellino, Valdomiro, Jairzinho. Starting for the first time, Ademir da Guia, and he'd be replaced by Mirandinha in the 56th minute and Dirceu. We already mentioned Ademir. He was the son of Domingos da Guia from the 1938 World Cup. And in fact, in that 1938 World Cup, his father had also played against Poland in that famous 6-5 match.
Yeah.
This is also a surprisingly good Polish side with the likes of Lato, Kazimierz Dana, Andrzej Jarmach. They would win the match when Lato went on a solo run from his own half and scored in the 76th minute. Brazil ended up without a medal in this World Cup. It must be said that Mario Zagallo had now managed Brazil to 2 straight Final Four finishes, but it was a disappointing end to a disappointing World Cup for Brazil. In historical terms, this World Cup is often referenced as Brazil's first attempt to Europeanize its game.
Well, I think it was a disappointing game, and what I remember very well from this game was not the game itself. It was a fight in the dressing room, an argument that almost came to physical blows between Leão and Marinho, the left fullback, Marinho Chagas, because Marinho Chagas was a very attacking kind of fullback, sometimes disobeying orders from Zagallo. It was a kind of funny situation because Zagallo was a very cautious manager, coach, and Marinho was a guy who wanted to go forward all the time. And that's how Lato scored that goal in the second half. Marinho went on these rampages upfield, and Lato got the ball and ran, as you said, half the pitch and scored the Brazil goal. At that point, nobody really was expecting anything anymore from Brazil. And there was a lot of argument whether Brazil should adapt and adopt the European kind of more physical approach to the game, or Brazil should stick to its old style of jogo bonito, the beautiful game. Actually, this is an argument that could go back to 1966. It was kind of the same situation, whether Brazil was falling behind physically and tactically in relation to European teams. That there was a kind of a pause in this argument when Brazil won the 1970 World Cup, but it restarted all over again after the 1974 World Cup. And this was reflected in the fact that for the 1978 World Cup, Brazil would then hire Cláudio Coutinho as manager. Cláudio Coutinho was a man who was very much in sync with the European way of seeing football. I remember he would read books from English journalists like Eric Batty, the modern way of coaching soccer, and all these ideas would reflect on the fact that that's the way Brazil played in 1978. So Brazil in 1974 was kind of halfway, not the Brazil, old Brazil of 1970, and not yet the more modern Brazil that Cláudio Coutinho brought to the country in 1978.
Looking at this World Cup, which players were made to be the scapegoats?
Marinho Chagas was one of them, mostly. Maybe Paulo César Caju, who was a player who was also always very controversial in Brazil. Rivellino, because he never became a leader that the team needed in midfield. The goalkeeper Leão was also a very controversial personality in Brazilian football. And Zagallo, of course, was the main victim of all of that, but he would come back eventually, and he would have new opportunities.
Now, was Zagallo constrained by the players he had at his disposal, or is there a belief that he should have changed his tactics?
He was constrained by the fact that Brazil was not the old Brazil. As I said, if you look at 1974, I'm repeating myself, but if you look at 1970, Carlos Alberto Torres, Clodoaldo, Gerson, Tostão, Pelé, that was the backbone of the team. Zagallo couldn't really, even if you accept criticisms of Zagallo, there was really not much he could do at that time. Brazil was at a transition moment.
What were the lessons learned from this relative failure, and how would you compare and contrast it with the failure of 1966?
Well, the lesson from 1966 is that there was disorganization in Brazilian football. It was not a matter of tactics of the players. It was the administrators who were disorganized. They couldn't come to find the proper team to the World Cup. Like they took 44 players to Europe in the 1966 World Cup. They're totally undecided about what to do. So that was one lesson in 1966. In 1974, the lesson was different. It was a realization that Brazil needed to adapt to new tactics that were being created and adopted in Europe, and that Brazil kind of disregarded them because Brazil maybe thought that could still play the same way, and Brazil couldn't play the same way. And that was reflected in the way Brazil played in 1978 under Cláudio Coutinho. You can even make some comparisons with what happened at that time to what goes on now. There is a lot of arguments in Brazil about why is Brazil again falling behind European teams? Why Brazil, for instance, now in preparation or trying to qualify for the 2026 World Cup in the United States, Brazil is not doing well in the qualifying games in South America. Why is Brazil kind of did so badly in 2018 and 2022 in the World Cup? So there is a lot of people in Brazil now saying that the Brazilian coaches have fallen behind. They need to learn from European coaches like Pepe Guardiola, like Real Madrid coach, and other European coaches, because Carlo Ancelotti, because the Brazilian coaches reflected, for instance, in Tite, who has just been fired as coach of Flamengo. People say Tite and other Brazilian coaches have fallen behind the new ideas in tactics for football. And also the Fernando Diniz from Fluminense, who failed totally. Everybody was saying, oh, Fernando Diniz from Fluminense is the new coach that Brazil needs. He was made the Brazil coach for the Brazilian team, and they totally failed. So there is a lot of people in Brazil who are convinced that Brazil at this point really should have an European coach as manager of the Brazil team for the next World Cup.
After losing to the Dutch, Mario Zagallo stated that only 3 players will survive the purge after the World Cup. And these would be Francisco Marinho, Carpegiani, and Dirceu. He said, in modern football, there is no room for those who can play only in one position. You already mentioned this, but when I was doing research for this, the one popular reason that was cited was that Brazil had miscalculated the progress of European football.
Exactly. Brazil had fallen behind tactically, yeah, in ideas.
Yeah,
Brazil had fallen behind. You said that the players Zagallo quoted were Marinho, the center back, right? Not the left back.
right,
Marinho, the
right.
center back.
Yeah,
Uh,
Francisco Marinho, yeah.
Francisco Marinho. And the other players were who?
Carpegiani and Dirceu.
Arpegiani
And Dirceu.
and the Dirceu. Dirceu was the idea that Zagallo had at the time of a player who, a little bit like himself, had been in the past, a player who could play in different circumstances, in different ways in a game, could play defensively and could play going forward. And Dirceu became an important player for Brazil in the 1978 World Cup.
Afterwards, were there ever any second guesses that who should have been recalled or which players should have been called up that were not?
No, not really. There were some arguments about who should be the goalkeeper, whether Leão really was the goalkeeper that Brazil needed. Of course, everybody realized that not having Pelé was going to be a big blow against Brazil. But no, some people at that time were very much in favor of Ademir da Guia. They said that Ademir should have been made first choice. But what happened in that game against Poland, Ademir da Guia was replaced in the second half. Zagallo took him off in the second half because Ademir da Guia never had the personality that you need to play in a psychological difficult game. He was a very cold player. He never really had that kind of enthusiasm, or at least never gave the impression that he was a kind of player who had a fighting spirit on the pitch.
In closing, how is this World Cup looked upon by Brazilian football historians? After 3 World Cup wins, was this considered just an anomaly or was there fear for the future?
It was fear for the future. That was a World Cup to forget. People in Brazil realized, hey, we have to wake up and we cannot sleep on our laurels. We have to adapt to the modern ideas, especially brought by teams like the Netherlands. And it is funny because many club teams in Brazil after the World Cup started playing the offside line as played by the Netherlands team at that World Cup.
With that, I'd like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, José Inácio, thank you once again.
You're welcome, Sean.
And hope to continue these discussions on Brazilian football history.
Yes, of course. At your disposal.
Thank you.